Packaging, and I'll introduce my colleague Francis McGuigan, who is going to take us through classification, label and packaging at the end of the transition period. So Francis, over to you.
Right, welcome, and thank you very much indeed, Matt. Welcome to everyone, and good morning. My name is Francis McGuigan. I've been in HSE as a policy advisor for over 20 years in a range of roles, and I've been one of the policy leads on the CLP regulation in the Chemicals Regulation Division since 2014. But since 2016, I've been working on EU exit work and the GB-CLP regulation. I'm going to take about 20 minutes to talk to you about the government and HSE's plans for classification, labelling and packaging, the new obligations and actions for companies and businesses after the end of the transition period. I'm also going to say a little bit more about the how, what you have to do to find the GB mandatory classification and labelling for a substance, how to notify to HSE as the GB-CLP agency, how to apply for an alternative chemical name for a substance in a mixture, and a little bit about how to label chemicals. And then that will be followed by a panel question and answer for about 10 minutes. And so please remember to submit your questions using the toolbar on your screens. I will also be talking about the prior informed consent regulation, or PIC, immediately afterwards. I'd also, if I could have the next slide, please. I just want to begin by explaining that I'm going to be talking about the retained Great Britain classification, labelling, packaging regulation, and it's not the UK CLP regulation, and that's because we've had to make changes to the chemicals exit statutory instrument covering the HSE regimes, including CLP, to reflect the withdrawal agreement, the NI protocol, and the government's committed to unfettered access. The GB-CLP regulation will apply to Great Britain, not UK, but will also apply to qualifying Northern Ireland goods placed directly on the placed on the Great Britain CLP market. I think the first thing I want to do is just offer everyone some reassurance. I think the main thing to remember is that the main duties and obligations on manufacturers, importers and downstream users and distributors to classify, label and package the substances and mixtures they place on the market will remain in place. There will still be mandatory or formally harmonised classification and labelling for substances, and Great Britain will continue to adopt the United Nations globally harmonised system for the classification and labelling chemicals in the same way at the EU as the EU does at the end of the transition period. And so really, if you know how to classify, label and package under the current CLP regulation, you'll still be able to follow more or less the same processes. That's identifying and examining the information, evaluating hazard information, setting specific concentration limits and factors, deciding what the classification is, and finally, reviewing the classification on a regular basis and looking out for any new scientific or technical information. Next slide, please. So what are the main changes? Well, there are 5 main changes really to remember. Firstly, Great Britain will have its own independent CLP system. That means we'll be no longer participating in the EU or the EU classification, labelling and packaging system, but the system that we have in Great Britain will be based closely on the current EU regulatory regime. And Great Britain, as I've mentioned before, will continue effectively to adopt the UN GHS system in the same way as the EU does at the moment. And this will provide continuity of business. But in future, Great Britain will be able to make its own decisions about the hazard classification of chemicals. Secondly, we'll have a new mandatory classification and labelling system and a Great Britain mandatory classification and labelling list. This new system will enable Great Britain to make its own decisions to align or take a different decision on hazard classification to other countries or other jurisdictions, including the EU. Great Britain will not automatically align with harmonised classification and labelling arising from the ECHA Risk Assessment Committee opinions or from the Commission's delegated regulations. Instead, there will be independent consideration by HSE with input from experts such as the Environment Agency where environmental hazards are involved before any decision is taken. There will be a requirement in law that HSE, as the GBCLP agency, will look at RAC opinions before making a recommendation to the Secretary of State for a final decision. But that decision will have to be made with the consent of the devolved administrations. And where the GBCLP agency, which will be HSE, does not recommend following the RAC opinion, then we will produce a new proposal for a new or revised Great Britain mandatory classification and labelling requirement. Or alternatively, we may propose to have no mandatory classification and labelling at all. I want to emphasise that we will continue to recognise EU harmonised mandatory classification and labelling for all the listed substances in Table 3 of Part 3 of Annex of Part 6 of the CLP regulation. And these entries will be incorporated into the new Great Britain mandatory classification and labelling list, the GBMCL list. Thirdly, there will be a new Great Britain CLP notification system. And that means that there will be, after the end of the transition period, there will be a requirement on manufacturers and importers to notify the classification and labelling of the substances they place on the market, whether on their own or in mixtures where they meet the criteria for notification. And the notifications will be made to the Great Britain CLP agency, or HSE, rather than ECHA, and they will appear in the new Great Britain notification database. I want again to emphasise that the previous notifications to the ECHA classification and labelling inventory that have been made by UK-based notifiers, whether through REACH registration or through self-classification, if they've been made prior to the end of the transition period, they will continue to be recognised, and no re-notification will be necessary, provided that the classification and labelling remains as notified. And we are busy preparing appropriate IT arrangements, which I'll discuss a bit later, to allow GB notification as soon as possible after the end of the transition period. And as part of that, we will also be establishing and maintaining a new Great Britain notification database. Fourthly, this is really a reminder to everybody that there are some important changes for some of the actors in the supply chain. Great Britain-based businesses that are GB-based distributors who are currently supplied from the EU or from an EEA or member state will become importers after the end of the transition period if these supply arrangements continue. And that means as suppliers that they will have importer obligations, just as they would if they were importing from somebody based in the rest of the world. And as importers, they will need to comply with the relevant Great Britain CLP regulation duties and obligations on importers. On the other hand, when exporting to the EU EEA, I just remind you that responsibility for those chemicals being imported into the EU from a UK-based business will rest with the EU or EEA-based importer. And that means that importer may need information from you in order to meet their obligations under the relevant legislation, including the EU CLP regulation. Finally, there'll be changes to GBCLP to implement the Northern Ireland Protocol and unfettered access. Next slide, please. I won't go into these actions in detail. I know that a lot of you will be doing all of these things and have done them already. I just want you to remember that apart from these particular actions, you need to think about the other chemicals regulations that might apply. For example, those relating to biocides, pesticides, cosmetics, or detergents. The most important thing really is to understand your role in the supply chain and your obligations. And you need to take a little bit of time to think that through and what you need to do to make sure that you're ready for the end of the transition period. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go into detail here about the Northern Ireland Protocol and the CLP regulation, but I just want to make the key point that the EU CLP regulation will continue to apply in Northern Ireland, including including published and upcoming adaptation to technical progress, that's harmonised classifications, and of course Annex 8, which will apply from the 1st of January 2021. And that means really that because the EU CLP regulation will have primacy in Northern Ireland, it will still be as if they were still in the EU and they are still in the single market. Next slide, please. So I now want to move on to some of the more practical aspects on how to go about meeting your obligations under the GBCLP regulation. You'll be familiar with a lot of the guidance that we published on the HSE's website, as it were, during the transition period. What we've been doing is working very closely with the HSE web team to make sure that there will be detailed guidance on the GBCLP system and on all of the chemicals regimes for the 1st of January, and they will be published on the HSE website. We've also been developing the systems and the forms that businesses will need for the Great Britain CLP regulation, including how to find the GB mandatory classification and labelling for substance, how to notify to HSE as the GBCLP agency, and how to apply for an alternative chemical name for a substance in a mixture. And I'd like to show you, as it were, a quick peek at what we're hoping to be able to provide. I also want to say that it won't be perfect on day one, on the 1st of January 2021. I know that there are going to be teething problems and there's going to be issues, I'm sure. But I want to reassure you that we are going to be very, very proportionate and pragmatic in the way that we approach it, and we will work with you. Next slide, please. Like to begin really with just the Great Britain mandatory classification and labelling list. What will happen is the GB MCL list will host all the existing MCL substances plus new and revised GB MCL entries when they're agreed. It will include entries from the 14th adaptation to technical progress. That's the opinions from the Risk Assessment Committee from 2017. It will include the 15th ATP, which is the 2018 RAC opinions, but it will not include the 17th ATP, which are the 2019 RAC opinions, as this has yet to be adopted by the Commission. The main thing really to remember is that as I say, unfortunately, there isn't a picture here, but what we've got here is that the Great Britain mandatory classification and labelling list will be in the form of an Excel spreadsheet, and it will be on the HSE website in the chemical classification pages. I've included the URL so that you know where it will be. It'll be searchable in the limited way that an Excel spreadsheet allows you to be able to search for information. But please remember that it includes all the harmonised classifications from Table 3, Part 3 of Annex 6. And again, changes to the Great Britain mandatory classification labelling list will take place annually to keep the entries up to date with scientific and technical developments. Next slide, please. This slide. Oh, sorry. I just realised that there we have a picture of of how roughly that Excel spreadsheet is going to look in terms of its layout. As you can see, it's pretty basic, but it will get you the information that you need. Next slide, please. Next, I'm going to give you a brief explanation of what has to be notified under the GBCLP notification process. And I want to underline that these information requirements that you see on this particular slide are the requirements as set out in the GBCLP regulation. And these have been put down so that we maintain, as it were, the basic information that has to be required as an absolute legal requirement. Next slide, please. I just want to talk about notification. It reminds you that it applies to you if you're a Great Britain-based manufacturer or importer who places chemicals on the GB market, or if you are a Northern Ireland-based manufacturer, downstream user or distributor who supplies qualifying Northern Ireland goods directly to the GB market. You will have to submit your notification within 1 month of placing new substances on the GB market, and it should contain the information that I've just in the previous slide. And this information, when you provide it to us, will eventually be included in the Great Britain CLP notification database. Notifications that have already been made to ECHA and which are included on the ECHA classification and labelling inventory on the 31st of December 2020 do not need to be re-notified. And I want to underline that HSE wants to make sure that Great Britain notifications are only made where necessary and that companies avoid unnecessary re-notifications. So there is a general exemption from notification in the Chemicals Exit SI that has just been, as I say, agreed and just gone through Parliament. And the key thing really is I would advise you is please can you check to see the information in terms of whether the exemption applies. In terms of submitting the new GBCLP notification, we are looking at a couple of ways of doing that. One way is that we would have an online notification web form, which will be allowed to be completed, and then what will happen is that information will be automatically included in the GBCLP notification database. But in the event that the web form is unavailable, then you will have to make the submissions using the Great Britain Notification Database Word template that we provided. But I do want to emphasize that, we will be understanding about the difficulties that people will have in terms of notification, particularly if they're new notifiers. And so remember, as I said, that if you've notified previously, it's unlikely that you will have to notify again unless there's been a change in terms of the classification of the substance that you are notifying. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go into detail about the provision of alternative chemical names for substances in mixtures. What's happening in some ways is that we are returning because, of course, originally member states were responsible for operating this particular system. You will be able to request an alternative chemical name, provided you are a GB-based manufacturer, importer, or downstream user, or a Northern Ireland-based manufacturer or downstream user supplying qualifying Northern Ireland goods directly to the GB market. Of course, it's got to meet the requirements and the criteria in the GBCLP regulation, which is Article 24. And you have to be able to demonstrate that including the name of the substance on the label or your safety data sheet would put the confidential nature of your business at risk. Where granted, the alternative name can be used on the label and in the safety data sheet for mixtures placed on the GB market. HSE is responsible for administering the requests, and we will be able to use a template. Can I have the next slide, please? This is the template that we are proposing to use. Each request should cover a single circumstance, but a single request that you make can cover multiple mixtures. And what you'll have to do is send the completed request to HSE. We'll confirm receipt of request, give you a reference number, we'll process the requests, and if we accept it, you'll be sent confirmation and a list of the mixtures for which the alternative name can be used. We intend to try and process requests within 6 weeks of receipt. And the good news is there are no fees currently for the submission of a request for the extension to include, for either the request or an extension to include other mixtures. But I would remind you that the alternative chemical name can only be used in Great Britain. Next slide, please. Just want to point out in terms of labelling chemicals, there are no significant changes in terms of what the labelling elements and requirements that are being used. But I just want to underline that the hazard labelling must be in English, although other languages may appear in addition to English on the label. And it will still be appropriate to include supplemental information on the label, including EUH statements and GB REACH statements in relation to REACH restrictions. But please remember there are also other chemicals labelling requirements, including those from biocides, pesticides, and detergents. Next slide, please. want to emphasize that the updated HSE chemical classification web pages will be available from the 1st of January, and that we will be continuing to publish information on the HSE Brexit web pages. Please feel free to look at all of these particular links to get more information and to keep updated. And of course, remember that there will also be regular e-bulletins. I'd like to say thank you very much, Hope, for your attention. And I hope that I'm going to be able to answer some of the questions that I'm sure that you'll have as a result of this presentation. So I'll hand back to Matt. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francis, again, for a very detailed overview of the changes and some of the insight into the practical arrangements that colleagues will need to take. So as per the previous session, we've got sort of 8 to 10 minutes for some questions. So let me just start going through some of them, Francis, and hopefully you can respond. So I've got a question from Sarah from Booton Chemical Safety. Just, will the GB MCL list be an exact copy of Annex 6 of the CLP regulation?
Thank you very much, Sarah. Yes, the answer is the GB mandatory classification labelling list will include all the entries, all the harmonised classifications that will be included in all the adaptation to technical progress up to the 31st of December 2020. Hence, I explained about the inclusion of the entries for the 14th ATP and the 15th ATP. And what will then happen is that we will add in new entries as they come along, but they will be GB mandatory classification and labelling rather than EU harmonised classifications.
Okay, thanks, Fran. So just going to follow up on the 15th ATP, because there's been a couple of questions on that. One again from Maya in Unichem. But again, will the 15th ATP published in the transition period be taken into account? So obviously, maybe just to reiterate what you just said there.
Yes, thanks very much. Yes, I want to reiterate that the position is that when we reach the end of the transition period, everything that is but part of the acquis at that time, including the 14th and 15th ATP, but not the 17th ATP, all of those entries will be included in the Great Britain mandatory classification and labelling list.
Thank you. And now, as ever with CLP questions, there's a couple of questions on poison centres, Francis. But just to clear those off, poison centre notification in the UK, is it likely to be the same as the EU? Now we know that that's a different department for that, but are you able to? This is questions from Alan in NV Kreidlinger. So obviously somebody trying to understand what the UK's position on poison centre is going to be.
Yes, thank you. It's a very interesting question. And I think the thing I want to point out is that the Department of Health and Social Care, working with the devolved administrations, has responsibility for the requirements in terms of Article 45 and the requirements in terms of Annex 8, which will not apply in Great Britain. So let me just start to say, but that from the 1st of January 2021, importers and downstream users will be encouraged to continue to voluntarily submit information on hazardous substances and mixtures placed on the market to, well, actually hazardous mixtures, of course, to the National Poisons Information Service. And that's in the form of safety data sheets. And so, again, effectively, it's a voluntary system. And as I say, this information is collected by the National Poisons Information Service and is used for the purposes of emergency response and as also for providing information and guidance on appropriate measures to take to try and reduce the impacts of particular hazardous mixtures on people. So the answer is that you will continue to you can continue to submit safety data sheets. There's no obligation to generate or submit a unique formula identifier. And again, as a reminder that, if you do have a UFI that's associated with it, then it is helpful if you could include that on the front page of the safety data sheet. And in terms of further guidance and information, I have received my understanding is that the Department of Health and Social Care will be publishing guidance on gov.uk in sometime, as I say, I think early next week. So this guidance is going to be coming out shortly.
Thank you, Francis. Just another clarification on exports, I think, from imports from Northern Ireland. So are classification labelling notifications to HSE required for products shipped from Northern Ireland to Great Britain? And that's from Jane in Devonish organisation.
The answer is that it depends, first of all, whether the actual item that's being exported is a qualifying Northern Ireland good that's being supplied directly to Great Britain. If it is one of those, then it will need to meet the requirements of the GBCLP regulation. Of course, if it's in Northern Ireland, it must meet the requirements of the EU CLP regulation first. But if you are exporting from Northern Ireland to Great Britain, then effectively it has to meet the requirements of the GBCLP regulation. But in most cases, that's not going to present a particular problem because of the commitments that have been made in terms of unfettered access. But you will need to think about, particularly, I think the thing you need to think about is probably notification. Because if, for example, if this is a new substance that's being placed on the market, as it were, in Great Britain, then it may be necessary to notify if it meets the criteria for notification.
And thank you, Francis. We'll stick on the question around notification. A question from Sophie from Emery Oleochemicals, and this is linked to REACH. So, is there a need to notify under GB CLP if the substance is planned to be registered separately under UK REACH? So, the interplay between CLP and REACH.
Yes, that's a good question. The answer is if you are REACH registration will be taken as notification under the CLP regulation. So if you are registering the substance under the UK REACH, that is considered as notification under the CLP regulation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There's a query around when we talk about GB distributors, and this is from Morris from Tronics. So GB-based distributors, are they particularly singled out for new requirements, or is it actually won't the new requirements apply to importers regardless of whether they are a distributor or not?
Absolutely right. We focused on distributors because these are people that originally have been able to rely on the information that has been provided to them from other actors in the supply chain, from the manufacturers and others. What will happen from the 1st of January is that if you receive a product from the EU or the EEA, you become the importer, and therefore you have to meet all the obligations under the CLP regulation. But your analysis is absolutely correct. All we're doing is reminding distributors, because up till now, a distributor has been able to rely on the classification and labeling that they have on the product and be able then to distribute it throughout Great Britain. From the 1st of January, that will not be the case.
Great. Thank you, Francis. I think similar to the REACH question, we had a question on transition period. So this is from Paul from Everbuild and Seeker company. For classification, labelling, notification, will there be any transition period?
There won't be a transition period, but there is, the position is that under the withdrawal agreement, under Article 41 and Article 42, it will be as I say, anything that has been placed on the market before the end of the transition period will continue to be allowed to make its way through the supply chain. So effectively, there will be, as it were, a period in which there will be, as it were, will be various goods that have been, that meet the requirements and that are labelled in accordance with either the EU, in accordance with the EU CLP regulation, will continue to be able to circulate within the market. But there are no transitional arrangements, and the reason for that is because, of course, we need to reflect the position that if information, the hazard information, particularly if the hazard information is more severe, this needs to be communicated to the supply chains more quickly. I do want to also emphasise that that HSE is going to be enforcing, and the various other enforcing authorities for the CLP regulation will be enforcing in a pragmatic and proportionate manner. But if I think the way to see it is that there is no fixed time that is set, but at some point you will need to make sure that the labelling is changed to reflect the GB CLP regulation requirements.
Thank you, Francis. And I think that also covers off a question from Anthea from Gulf Oil around labelling as well. So let's just finish with one final question on only representatives from Peter from Reachwise. Can a Great Britain only representative fulfil the GB notification requirements on behalf of a non-GB manufacturer? So that, for example, a GB-based distributor do not have to do this.
That's a good question, but unfortunately, unlike REACH, there is no only representative function under the GB CLP regulation or under the EU CLP regulation. That means that you're not allowed to appoint an only representative, and the responsibility for meeting the various obligations in terms of notification and also the requirements in terms of particularly in terms of notification, that has to be met by the person that is placing the substance or the mixture on the market.
Right. Well, thank you for that, Francis. And you kindly agreed to do a double shift for colleagues, because actually you are now going to stay on the call, and we're going to. You're going to talk to us about the prior informed consent regulation. So thanks again for doing both. And we know that that it's not necessarily, this isn't your policy area, but we're covering it off anyway for colleagues. So if you're okay to carry on, we'll hand back to you and talk about prior informed consent. Thank you, Francis.